of 10,000s of users are using your application simultaneously, this additional time taken is going to add up exponentially, because for each user using, they might generate 1,000 logs. So for 10,000 users using, you're going to generate like 1,000,000 logs or more. So to avoid all of these, one of the best techniques that we often use, is something called stashing logs, or also called as log stash. The idea is that you're not going to write the file. There will be another application intermediate which will write the file. Your purpose in your application for logging is, whenever you perform logging, it should reach this application and send the line to this application and get back and continue the rest of the code. This application will take this line and store it here. That's the purpose of it. So that your log file is maintained with another application that takes care of it, that takes care of reading and writing and everything. So the time taken for your user work, whatever it might be, to be completely performed is lesser than expected. These seem like some minor things, right? But over time, these end up being quite a large amount of concepts, quite a large amount of operations that will help a lot of people be better developers. And to be honest, that's what separates a junior developer from a senior developer, because any developer can perform logging. Only a good developer can perform logging efficiently. That's again a point that I want to make. But yeah, let me not dwell too much time on this. I'm just going to move ahead to the next part. But before I do that, for your reference, just so you can take a look at this in the future as well, I'm just going to share this log stash. If you remember, we talked about Elasticsearch in prior, right? Prior to the break. Elasticsearch has something called log stash, where the purpose of log stash is all the logs that you need to store, instead of storing and getting information that yes, this log is stored, go back, you just send it to log stash. Log stash will then take care of storing it within. So the whole idea of log stash is that when you have multiple applications, multiple, let's say, services, all of them will go to Logstash, and Logstash will end up saving it. This will save time. I'm not sure where they have specified, or like the purpose of it, main purpose of it, but yeah, that's the main purpose of it. That's the main purpose of keeping, let's say, something like this. I'm not sure. Yeah, it's not particularly specified, but it's fine. You basically have the idea of why we do that. Anyway, with this, let's move ahead back to our code. We've spent a lot of time looking at a lot of things. Let's get back to our code. Any log that is written will be written here in info.log. Now, here's the thing. Let's assume I'm creating a calculator app, a very simple calculator app. And within the calculator app, I'm going to perform the following simple operation. For any user that runs this application, we're going to take the same code. Let's save time. I think it's in exceptions. Yeah, there we go. Right, so here's what we're doing. We are reading two numbers. After we're reading two numbers, we're performing division between those two numbers, and we're printing it. After that, there could be some exception that might occur. So whatever exception occurs, I'm just printing some unknown error occurred. Please try again later. And at the end, I'll just print like this will always be executed and so on. Now, here's what I'll do. I will add some logs here that will be stored in info.log for my understanding as a developer. First up, let's assume we don't have this exception handling at all. Let's completely ignore this. Let's assume we don't have this. Now, at this point of time, if I have a code like this, okay, let's not do that. We already know this. Let's assume we have it. Yeah, let's go ahead. Now, first thing I'm going to do is I'll add logger.input info. I'll add a log, and the log that I will add here, again, please remember, whenever we start with logger, there are multiple ways to add logs. The ways to add logs generally are either debug, this is the lowest level of severity. Debug is the smallest level of severity in terms of logging, where you're only performing logging to get some information, just some debug information for you to understand it. That's the only purpose. The next level of this is logger.info. Info is where you're storing some informational message that is required for you. Then there is logger.warning. If something wrong happens, but it's not an error, it's just something that is a warning. It does not crash the program, it does not uh, get treated as a very big error. It's just treated as a very small warning that can be overridden without worrying about it. Then go for logger.warning. If it's an error, go for logger.error. In the worst case, if it is critical, go for logger.critical. Currently, I'm going to use logger.info because I need only the information, that is, what is the input that user has entered. Because this program might be used by 100 users, 1,000 users, and I want to know whoever used it, what input did they use so that I can get to know for what input errors have occurred. So I'm just going to add a formatted string here, input by user is A is going to have A value and B is going to have B value, something like this. Our logger info is done. And then for exceptions that occur, I have to save those exceptions as well. So for that purpose, when it comes to exceptions, I'll use logger.error instead. Here I'm just going to write exception occurred, that is E. This is what I'm going to point out. So all the print statement will still be printing on the console, but they won't be stored in the info.log file. Only things that will be stored in the info.log file are your logger info and logger error. Now, an additional thing for you to take a look at it and be able to remember it and observe it better, you can add a lot of additional features within this, a huge amount of additional features. One of them is enqueue. Let's say there are a lot of files that are performing logging. To make sure it's async, you can do this. Immediately, we don't need to do that. Let's not worry about all of this. But for our immediate purpose, our immediate understanding, I'm going to use this colors, possibly. So let's add some colors to identify different logs. I'm just going to use loggers dot opt colors is true, and then we'll add error on top of it. And within this error, the whole thing that will come up, the whole error that will come up, I'm just going to specify it in, let's say, red color. That's pretty much all that we'll do. So this is the opening and closing tag to indicate that it's in red color. So when colors equals true, it will automatically look for these tags and change the color. That's what it's supposed to. So now that we know this, let's take a look at this. I need to go to the next directory. Let's go to our TTS application. Let's run Python dummy.py. I'll enter the first number as 10. I'll enter the second number as 2. It executed. I'll run again. I'll enter the first number as 10. I'll enter the second number as 0. It's done. Now it's time for us to open the log. Some user has said, hey, I tried running your program, but it crashed or it gave me an error. It just said exception occurred. I want to know what happened. At that time, just open up your log info.log and you can see what exactly happened here. You can see this is the info and this is the error. And you can see the year, month, date, the time up to milliseconds, what category, and then which file. The file is the main file. Whatever file you're initially executing, that is considered as main file or main logic. Hence, you get main. Line number 8 and line number 12. This is where the logs were done. And this is what the input was. For this, there's no exception. But when input was this, we got an exception. And these files help you understand a lot of things about it. For example, you're running a script to perform something in Python, and you're running the script overnight or over 2 or 3 days. 2 or 3 days later, you come up to see and identify what are the errors that you have faced. Best way to do that, just take a look at the logs. You'll get to figure out all the errors that you're facing right then and there. So essentially, this is how logging works in short. So if you have any queries so far till here, please feel free to let me know. I will go through the queries that you might have and answer them. If there are no queries so far, we can move ahead to the next part. All right. So I presume there are no queries so far, which means we can move ahead. Right. So yeah, let's go ahead and move on to the next part of this. Right. So now that we understood how log works and we have a dummy.py, um, I'm just gonna move these to a different directory. I'm just gonna create a directory called logging basics, and I'm gonna move these over here just for our understanding. There we go, we're done. Now we're gonna get back to our particular application, and let's start with it. And again, as a suggestion, it's only a suggestion. That is, I use Loggeroo instead of Logger to directly do this, because if I use Logger, I have to do a lot of additional um, code which is not productive, and that's something I really don't want to do at times. So I just directly use this and I focus on the more productive stuff. Some client might ask, hey, create an application that does this. So my entire focus should be purely on what the client requires, right? So these are not the things that should be our focus. So as tempting, again, this comes from me when I was a junior developer. I used to think about this. As tempting as it sounds to learn every little thing about a programming language from scratch, you don't have to learn the things from scratch which are common in every application, because you can create a template of it, you can save it once, and you reuse the exact same thing. And that's what Loggeroo does for us. Anyway, let's move away from this. Let's move ahead back to the next point. Now let's start our application. So before we start our application, again, if there are any queries still here, uh, please let me know. Till here, any queries at all. If all these concepts and all these logics are very clear and you have zero queries on them, we can move ahead right away. By the time, I'll just open a couple of links. If there are any queries meanwhile, please feel free to let me know. Right. So here's the next thing we're going to start with, Flask. Flask is um, a framework that is available on top of Python. And yeah, this is one link I'll open separately so that you can see this. The purpose of Flask is to make sure, as we saw, it's a framework. The purpose of Flask is to make sure that you are able to create full-fledged Python applications within it. There are so many things you can do within it. Again, we're not going to go through everything. We're only going to look at the very basic operations of Flask. Things like adding logging, things like making sure that we are able to debug, things like making sure that we are able to receive input from the user, all these routing, for example, all these basic things is what we're going to do. But if you really want to learn this in detail, there's so many things about it. And this entire tutorial is done really, really well. Just for reference, it's done very well for you to use. So it's something that I would highly suggest anybody who wants to learn this, try this out so that you get to understand this better. Just an example, Flask has something called SQL Alchemy. SQL Alchemy is a database abstraction layer that you can use so that you can write all your code here to connect to the database. That will avoid you writing additional code that you don't need to. There's so many things that come into this. But again, I'm not going to go into all of these. It's a beautiful framework if you really want to learn. It's a framework that some of the biggest applications in the whole wide world are developed using this, just for reference. So the latest version we have is version 3, just for reference. This has been recently released. Yeah, 30th of September. That's when it was released. This had a huge change from everything else from the previous one. There were a lot of things that were done. Entire Flask internally has been reworked in the latest version. So that's the version we're going to use, and we're going to start with this. All right, so let's go ahead and create our first Flask application. I hope I've sent the link. All right, now to install Flask, it's a pretty simple thing. Oh yeah, and prior to installing Flask, one other thing. Uh, I did not point this out in prior. Let's say, for instance, um, Eric is, I hope you guys don't mind if I just take a few of us as examples to just work around a couple of things in this program. I hope that's not an issue. If it is whatsoever, again, please feel free to let me know. Let's assume we have Eric and Baron who are creating the next generation Python application. Eric has developed a prototype, a basic version of this application, and there are a lot of libraries that Eric has used for this application. And Eric wants to share this with Baron. Now, the problem here is if he shares just the application, Baron would also need to know what libraries he has used. He can get to know that from the import statement. However, what if Eric has used some specific version? Take a look at this. Flask current version is 3.0.0. What if Eric used 2.3.3? And when Baron gets this code after 30th of September, he sees there's Flask in it. And he installs Flask, and the Flask value installed is 3.0.0. So Baron gives a call to Eric like, hey, I got your code, I installed all the libraries, but it's not working. So it's like, but it's perfectly working in my system. So it should work in your system as well. However, because of this irregularities, it won't. So one of the better ways to resolve this, one of the better ways to handle this is when Eric sends his code, Eric should also send all the libraries with the versions that he has installed. If he has installed requests with version as 0.1.2, Flask with version 2.3.3, he needs to send all these information as well. So Baron gets to know this. He can install all of these directly with a one line command, and he can execute them. That is the purpose. And that's exactly what you want to do. So let's try it out. Let's see how that can be done. To do that, first, let me install Flask here, and then I'm going to do that. Remember, we are within this basics environment. So every package installed within this environment can be exported to a text file, which can show us what are the packages that are installed. So first, let me install Flask. Okay, before installing Flask, let's create that. So here, to store package information installed, you need to run the following command. Pip freeze greater than symbol indicates that you're outputting this to a file. The file will be often called requirements.txt. And this is a common thing, a common theme that you see anywhere. Wherever you install anything, they often have a requirements.txt file. Maybe these guys don't, but because this is a common thing, right? But many, I'll just search for ASR, one of the Python ASR that we saw earlier for reference. Many of them will have a requirements.txt file. I'm unable to show it here. Um, Possibly these people don't use other requirements, but yeah, most of them will have it. So whenever you're downloading a repository from somebody else, you can do this. Let's just write pip freeze greater than requirements.txt. Once you do this, requirements.txt file is created, and you can see all the packages I've installed till now and the version of them. I've installed Loggeroo recently, and its version was 0.7.2. I've installed requests today, and this is its version. Whatever package I've installed along with its version will be listed here, even ice cream, whatever it is. So some of these packages install some other packages as dependency. So you'll find those as well. So please don't worry if you have never installed something like Six or Certify or Carset. Some of the packages will require some other packages as dependencies. So they install them by themselves. Now let's install Flask. I'm just going to use pip install Flask. Once you do this, it'll download a lot of packages because Flask requires a huge amount of packages inbuilt. Now let's freeze these requirements. Now take a look at it. About 5, 6 different packages are installed. There's Flask, there's markup save, there is workzig, URL library 3, I think. So a lot of additional packages are also installed along with Flask for our reference. And this is why requirements.txt is important. Now, once Eric is sending this code, he will also send this requirement.txt to Baron. And when Baron receives this, Baron is going to create a new virtual environment. He'll enter that virtual environment. After entering the virtual environment, he needs to install all of these. What if there are hundreds of packages? It's going to be difficult to install every one of these, right? Python makes it easy for us. You just have to write pip install -r. That means recursively, repeatedly, all the things that you have within a file, and then the file name. Once you do that, it's going to install every little package available here. All of them are already installed in my case, which is why it says requirement already satisfied. This is how you get to share such information. Now, install all packages with their versions from text file is pip install -r requirements.txt. All right. With this, let's go ahead to the next part. Let's start our application finally. Okay, I'm just going to create a file called app.py. And let me start with this. Now, one thing that we need to know as a basic concept, within Python is that we use some inbuilt variables which start with double underscore. We use that. So let me explain what that is. We have something called if double underscore name is equal to double underscore main followed by double underscore in a string. And then we write our first line of code here. And I'm going to tell what this means. This indicates that it indicates that whatever script you're running, it is running as the main content, as the main file. So the idea is this. There is a Python interpreter which looks into backend of Python when you execute it. It has a special variable called double underscore name. What it does is When it sets double underscore name is equal to double underscore main, that means your program is starting then. That is your entry point to the program. So this is where your program actually runs. So when you import or when you start a Python script, when you start running this, this should be written because anything you write within this block of code will only run when this application is directly executed and not when it is imported. I'll clear this out. The code written here executes only when you directly run app.py. It doesn't execute when you import app.py. This is what we need to know. All right. So yeah, an example of this main purpose of this is if you want to import this app.py elsewhere, you don't want some code to run even then. I'll explain this. Okay. Okay, I'm so sorry. I did not observe this. Do we have access to this requirement.txt file? Oh, yeah, I'm so sorry. I did not get a notification for some reason for the text here. I just saw that. So please bear with that. But yeah, you can generate your own requirements.txt file using this. However, if you want, you can install from mine as well, and I can share that if required, which is going to be just a text content, essentially. Most likely, this will match with what we have, but yeah, I'm just sharing that for our reference to begin with. Anyway, let's move ahead from here. Now, let's start with this. Now, once you start getting into the entry point of the program, yeah, why we should write this, right? Back to this. App.py is going to have a lot of things within it. An important thing in app.py, again, this is a naming convention. Whenever we create a real world or web application or your Python application, you're going to name the entry point of your application as app.py because this makes sense. It's the application file. Hence, we call it app.py in short. Now, here's the thing. Your app.py may have some variable that you have created, and this variable you want to import in another file. If you want to import it in another file, you're going to use import app. And when you import app, you're going to use app.variable in another file. This is one way to import other modules. When you create your own module or your own file, you can import it in another module or file by just writing import space that Python file name. And within that Python file, any variable you want, you can access, or if it's a function, you can access it with app.fun as well. This is how we can access any of these. Now, for our reference to understand and to work around this from scratch, here's one thing that we need to know. Any application that we generally end up creating, if we import that application, all line of code in that application will run by default, unless it's a function. All other lines will run by default. Now, we have a piece of code in app.py that starts our entire application. If you're importing it elsewhere and you run that, it'll start your entire application for a second time when you import it. And that'll cause problems. We don't want that to happen. To avoid that, we write the code that should be executed when your application is executed. Only when you run python app.py, only when you run this, Whatever code must be executed, that is the code you write within here. So when this file is imported, that won't be executed. That's the whole purpose of this.